I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease in January 2021, and I'd been experiencing symptoms since the summer before, so about July, August of 2020. So at that point, I had already been vegan since 2016. So I'd been vegan for quite a while. But during my journey to remission, I didn't really receive that much in the way of information from my medical team about the impact of diet and lifestyle. The treatment was very much focused on like the medical aspect. And I knew from being vegan how much of an impact that what we put in our body on a daily basis can impact your overall well-being and how you feel on a day-to-day. So I made an appointment with a nutritionist in my local area, and she was shocked, actually. She was like, considering you're deficient, you're severely anemic, you're deficient in vitamin D, you have Crohn's disease, active Crohn's disease, and you're telling me that you're feeling remarkably well. She said, I'm going to put it down to the fact of your diet playing a contributing role in this, and also the fact that I move my body a lot. I'm a yoga teacher and I'm moving around quite a lot. So for me, that was real confirmation that I was on the right path.
Are you ready to live the life you deserve? Do you want to feel vibrantly healthy and reach your optimal weight without dieting while being kind to animals and the planet? Then you're in the right place at the right times. Welcome to Plant-Based Eating for Health with your host, certified plant-based nutritionist, Kathleen Gage.
Well, Helena, I know that you have a book that's coming out in January 2023, and I know you're vegan, you're a photographer. So I'd love to start with, when did you start your photography?
I started my photography in 2019. So I'd been freelance for 1 year beforehand, but that first year was crazy and chaotic. And I was taking on all sorts of things really just to kind of make ends meet and see what I enjoyed. So I was doing a mixture of social media, photography, blog writing. I also teach yoga. So I was teaching a little bit of yoga as well. And then I had that year to really kind of see what sat with me. And I decided I wanted to strip away a lot of the noise in my business and just focus on photography. So from 2019, I really kind of lasered my focus in just on shooting for clients. And it's sort of gone on since then.
And you've really evolved into where you do food photography and it's vegan food. So when did you become vegan?
Oh, so I became vegan in 2016. Okay. At the time, I was working in fast fashion, and there was like a big editorial angle to the brand that I was working with. And that was my role in the company. I was overseeing all of the editorial content for Europe. And part of that was interviewing lots of brands and influencers, but also at that time, we were interviewing lots of vegan chefs and vegan influencers. And I'd never really heard that much about veganism in 2016, so I was intrigued. I also got to taste a lot of the foods that they were creating and discovered that it was amazing and flavoursome and beautiful. So just as an experiment, I thought I'm going to cut out meat just for 1 month and go vegetarian and see how that lands. And I really enjoyed it. And then my journey into not just the flavor, but also sort of the education around animal welfare and environmentalism kind of came with that. And at the end of the month, I had a sausage sandwich and I was like, no, this isn't sitting. I'm just going to carry on. And I think it took about 6 to 9 months before I became fully vegan. And I've been vegan ever since.
Well, and that's interesting because I actually started on a 7-day no meat and dairy journey. And that was about a little over 4 years ago. And I did it because I had inflammation. And I thought, okay, maybe what I'm reading is true. I can get rid of my inflammation. And I thought I'll give it 7 days. Within 2 days, the inflammation was gone. And I thought, okay, I'll give it another 7 days. And it was really about plant-based eating at the time, which now I'm a full-fledged vegan. And you mentioned it took 6 to 9 months to become a vegan. So what was the distinction for you? When you first started out, it was more because for whatever reason you chose, but then you crossed that invisible line that many of us do. And you said, I'm vegan and I can't go back.
Yeah, a friend of mine at that time described it like in The Matrix, where you take the pill and you can't unsee. If you've seen The Matrix, the reference makes sense.
Yes.
And it definitely felt like that for me. I remember I was just annoying myself at the time because I was vegetarian, and the more of those documentaries I was watching on Netflix that a lot of us in the vegan community have watched, like Cowspiracy at the time, and I read Jonathan Safran Foer's book, I think it's called Eating Animals, and that was really impactful for me as well. So yeah, it took 6-9 months to make that transition from veggie to vegan, and at that time, as I'm sure you remember, it was a lot harder to integrate veganism into your day-to-day because there weren't the brands that we have. Like in the UK, at least, we have like Wicked Kitchen and Plant Kitchen, and all of the supermarkets have their own amazing ranges now of vegan food, which is great. It makes it so much more accessible and easy to incorporate in your day-to-day. But at that time, you could obviously buy oat milk and soy milk in the supermarket, but there weren't sort of the sort of quick and easy options. It was definitely cooking from scratch. And if you went to a restaurant, you were lucky if they knew what that was. You did have to do a bit of explanation. So I think those were the factors that kind of made my journey from veggie to vegan that bit longer.
Right. Now, with your cookbook, when you decided to write your cookbook, and it is called, let me put my glasses on here, the Plant-Based Diet, or the Plant-Based Crohn's and Colitis Cookbook. Now, that's really interesting because, as I mentioned before we actually started this conversation, I just talked to a woman who her focus is on endometriosis. And what I'm finding is there are people that they were afflicted with some kind of a disease themselves. They went on this search of information to reverse the pain and the suffering. And as a result, they became very knowledgeable and very well researched on a topic. So is that what happened to you? What made you decide to pick that topic of all topics?
So it is interesting. So I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease in January 2021, mm-hmm. And I'd been experiencing symptoms since the summer before, so about July, August of 2020. So at that point, I had already been vegan since 2016. So I'd been vegan for quite a while. But during my journey to remission, I didn't really receive that much in the way of information from my medical team about the impact of diet and lifestyle. The treatment was very much focused on like the medical aspect. And I knew from being vegan how much of an impact that what we put in our body on a daily basis can impact your overall well-being and how you feel on a day-to-day. So I made an appointment with a nutritionist in my local area, and she was shocked, actually. She was like, considering you're deficient, you're severely anemic, you're deficient in vitamin D, you have Crohn's disease, active Crohn's disease, and you're telling me that you're feeling remarkably well. She said, I'm going to put it down to the fact of your diet playing a contributing role in this, and also the fact that I move my body a lot. I'm a yoga teacher and I'm moving around quite a lot. So for me, that was real confirmation that I was on the right path with the diet that I was on. And it just encouraged me to kind of do some further research. And here in the UK, there's a gastroenterologist who's been really influential for me. He's called Dr. Alan Desmond, and he's a really big advocate for plant-based diets, specifically for people with IBD. So that really encouraged me too.
Well, and I want to dig further into that. But before we do, I want to remind people you're listening to the Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show. I'm Kathleen Gage, your host, and I'm talking with Helena Murphey, who is the author of the soon-to-be-released show. And depending on when you listen to this, it may have already been released, but it's the Plant-Based Crohn's and Colitis Cookbook. And I'm curious, how common is Crohn's disease and how common is IBD and colitis?
So when I was diagnosed, I'd actually never heard of Crohn's disease. It is said that it's genetic, so you're more likely to have it if someone in your family has it. But for me personally, that actually wasn't the case. We don't know of anyone in my family who has a diagnosis. But it's fairly common. In the UK, over 500,000 people have Crohn's or colitis. And in the US, 1.6 million people have it. And there's 70,000 new cases of diagnosis each year. So it's not an insignificant amount of people.
Right. So what exactly is it? Because I've heard of Crohn's disease, but and I hear it can be very debilitating and very painful. What is it, and where does it come from?
Sure. So I was also in that camp when I was receiving my diagnosis. A lot of the doctors kept saying, we think it's Crohn's disease. And I was kind of like, I don't know what that is. So it took me a while to actually say, put my hand up and say, excuse me, can someone tell me what Crohn's disease is? I don't know. But it's an inflammatory bowel disease, so IBD, and that's an umbrella term for Crohn's and colitis. And it's a chronic autoimmune condition. So unfortunately, there is no cure at this moment in time. So if you are diagnosed with Crohn's or colitis, you will have it for the rest of your life. But treatment is aimed at getting patients to remission. So it's possible to get to remission. So I'm currently in remission, which is amazing. And I found remission in January of this year. And you get to remission through a mixture of medications and also diet and lifestyle. But yeah, it can be very debilitating. At one point, I did lose all semblance of my day-to-day normal life. As you mentioned, some of the symptoms can include chronic fatigue. So really, no matter how much sleep you have, waking up feeling exhausted, anemia, and that can be from malabsorption or blood loss in the stool, diarrhea, cramping, weight loss. My weight went down a lot, again, because you either feel not hungry because you have diarrhea, and the idea of eating is very bit scary sometimes because you associate sometimes food with pain, as well as other things like joint pain and sometimes loss of normal menstrual cycle. So yeah, lots and lots of unpleasant symptoms.
Well, I've heard horrendous things about it. And now you mentioned that you're in remission. Do you still take the same medications you were taking, or has that been minimized? And then I'd love to talk about your book and why you decided to write the book and what people can expect from the book.
Of course. So my journey on the medications has changed. And I think a lot of people who suffer from IBD will have a similar story to tell. You might be started on something, maybe it works for a little bit, but then it stops working. So you have to pivot and change direction. So yeah, I started on one particular drug, it worked, but then my symptoms came back. So I got put back on it and then it didn't work. So then there's lots of different trial and error, but there are some amazing medications. I'm on biologics, which is a fortnightly injection. And that's worked really well for me, and they do work really well for a lot of people. So yeah, I think it's important to stress that with IBD, it is a holistic approach of medication alongside the diet.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because a lot of times I think that within the plant-based movement and the vegan movement, that especially vegans who eat plant-based, which I happen to be one of them, but we can get on our high horse and say, well, plant-based eating will fix everything. And it doesn't necessarily fix everything. It improves a lot of conditions and it does reverse certain diseases. But how much does eating and nutrition and plant-based eating impact either a flare-up of Crohn's disease or minimizing the risk of having flare-ups?
Yeah, it plays quite a big part. So if you're in a severe flare, so for instance, at some point last year, I couldn't really eat solid food at all. But in general, the advice is to avoid spicy foods. Some of this is common sense as well, really. Alcohol, caffeine, which is a laxative if you've already got diarrhea and you're running to the bathroom 10 times a day. It's best to avoid caffeine, processed foods, heavily processed foods, fried foods. So all of the kind of common suspects, as well as sort of insoluble sources of fiber. So vegetables like with their skins on, it's good to kind of peel them if you're going to, and have lots of really cooked soft veg. So a lot of my lived experience of kind of managing my flare has informed my approach to the recipe development of the cookbook. So yeah, just kind of casting my mind back to what it felt like to be in that situation. I just wanted things that were very easy to digest, a lot of things that have already been kind of like pre-digested. And by that, I mean processed in a food processor. So there's lots of soups and stews. I want to say curry, but like no spices in the curry. So I think very soft and creamy. And then also things like dips and sauces, things that are spreadable and just easy to eat.
Eat and digest. Well, you said that, you know, it's a lot of it is common sense, and you would think that if something was common sense, people would do it. But I think we can look at a lot of people's health and realize that even though something's common sense, it's like me. I've been sober for 39 years, and I used to be a very heavy drinker. And I never, you know, I didn't always get in trouble, but when I drank, I always, you know, when I got in trouble, it was always because I drank, you know, and it's like, connect the dots. It took me a while. And once I did, it was like, okay, that's it. I just can't drink anymore. And so with foods, it can be very tricky because the food manufacturers, they make food so addictive that it's hard for people to not eat certain foods. And I do yoga in the morning, and I turn on a YouTube video, and it never ceases to amaze me, the commercials they have right before the video. It's going to be a yoga video, and it's a medication. In the United States, we actually are one of the only countries that can advertise prescription drugs. And in any given half hour or hour TV show, you probably will see at least 5 to 10, maybe 15 commercials that are prescription-based commercials. And so people are being convinced that there's, you know, a Band-Aid they can put over things. Now, with your book, what will people find in your book that will be helpful to the Crohn's disease, and the type of recipes that you've created?
Sure. So a few things. The opening chapters of the book have quite a lot of like evidence-based research about the role of meat, the role of dairy, and the role of fiber, specifically in relation to IBD. So hopefully people who have Crohn's and colitis will find those studies quite interesting. And then all of the recipes have been designed to be very customizable, because something I haven't mentioned is that we all have very different trigger foods. So while I might be able to tolerate mushrooms or peppers really well, someone else with IBD might think, I will die if I eat carrots. No.
Right.
So it really is, it would be an impossible task, I think, to create a cookbook with strict recipes that every single person who has an IBD diagnosis could cook and eat. So it was important to me to offer substitutions in the recipes. For instance, if you can't tolerate mushrooms here, you could switch it for aubergine, that kind of thing. And then a lot of the more sort of flair-friendly recipes are tagged as such. And a lot of the ones with sort of nuts are tagged because some people, if they have strictures, which is a narrowing of the intestines, which is caused from repeated inflammation and healing, nuts can become a problem. They can get stuck. And the same if you have a colostomy. So it's, lots of the recipes are designed to be a springboard for inspiration rather than you have to follow it this way.
Wonderful. Well, and that's nice that there's some flexibility in that. And I want to remind people you're listening to the Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show. I'm your host, Kathleen Gage, and I'm talking with Helena Murphey, and she has her new book coming out very shortly. And you can get that on Amazon. We'll put the link below. Now, I know you have a great Instagram channel. How can people find you? What's the easiest way for people to find you, whether it be Instagram or your website? Your photography is amazing. I got caught up. I went down a rabbit hole looking at all your photography. It's like, wow, this is great. I love your yoga pictures. So how can people reach you?
Thank you. So my website is helenarosemurphy.net, and my Instagram account is HelenaRose_photography.
Excellent. We'll make sure to put that in the show notes too. So as you are getting further and further into being a vegan, and your photography is being seen by so many people around the globe, and you have your new book coming out in January of 2023, where do you see your career and your mission as a vegan, an outspoken vegan? Because anybody who gets on a podcast and talks about veganism, you just got put in the class of being outspoken. And it's so funny because people say, oh, you vegans, you're always shoving your beliefs down our throats. And it's like, oh, so compassion is shoving down your throat? Okay. But where do you see yourself going?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I really hope that the cookbook in particular is more an offering. And I hope that it's hopefully a source of inspiration, she says humbly, because people's journey with IBD can really impact their relationship to food in a negative way. And I want people to fall back in love with food if it's possible. I understand how painful it is and how frustrating it can be. So with the cookbook in particular, it's to connect people with a way of eating that can hopefully help them to feel good, to help them to be nourished, and to help them feel inspired. And photography for me is a way to do that. And that kind of that hope really inspired my approach to the photography in the cookbook. I deliberately have made everything super vibrant, super colorful, shooting with hard shadows to make it really dynamic, just because I wanted it to be fun to look at.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I do encourage people to go to your Instagram channel and to look at your website, because the photography is amazing. Now, do you see yourself, when the book comes out, are you going to be doing book signings in your local market? Do you see yourself traveling around doing demonstrations? Where do you see yourself going with that?
Yeah, I mean, I've never done a live TV cook along or anything like that, but I think I would be open to it. And maybe I'll organize something in my local area in Bristol in England for fellow IBD warriors. It's interesting. As I said at the beginning, I didn't know what Crohn's disease was, and I didn't know anyone who had it. But as soon as you do have it and start talking to other people about it, it's amazing how many people will say, oh, my cousin has that, my aunt has that, my sister. So now I've got a whole handful of people I can talk to about this condition.
Nice. So, yeah. Well, in closing, Helena, what are your final thoughts for people as far as like making the changes that would give them a better quality of life? What are some steps they can take that would actually help them to release the behaviors that are not serving them and then move into a healthier lifestyle?
Of course. So I would say be kind to yourself. No one ever learns anything new through shame, whether that's shaming someone else or shaming yourself. Baby steps is important, and preparation and organization as well, especially if you're used to cooking and eating in a certain way. Adopting new ways of cooking or preparing foods, it's a shift in your mind and it takes time. So learning how to read the ingredients on the back of packets in the supermarket, sometimes that can be a big hurdle. All of a sudden your shopping takes 2 hours instead of 1. So maybe just introducing one new recipe per week or one new recipe per fortnight, until you have a whole collection of new favorites, new staples that you can go to that don't take very long, that are quite simple, and that you really love.
Wonderful. Well, I've been talking with Helena Murphey, who is the author of the Plant-Based Crohn's and Colitis Cookbook. I encourage you, when this comes out, to go to Amazon and do a pre-order. Get the book, and if you definitely are somebody who deals with Crohn's or colitis, I would say get the book. I mean, here's somebody who has had this disease. She's reversing it. She's minimizing the inflammation and everything that comes with it. So I just want to encourage you to get the book and to live a healthy life. This is Kathleen Gage with the Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show. I thank you for listening in and viewing in, and wish you much success.
Thank you for your commitment to an ethical life through plant-based food choices. The kind of choices that are kind to your body, the environment, and most of all, animals. Be sure to leave a review and rating of the Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show.